What's up guys, welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. In this video I'm going to be going through how to review your cards to work out if they're worth sending off for professional grading at PSA or Beckett. Now if you haven't seen my previous video when I went through just the basics of condition grading in general, I recommend to go and watch that first because there's a lot of background information in there which will be helpful before you watch this video. And I should just say this video is not going to be about the process of how to physically submit cards to PSA or Beckett in terms of the submission forms, packaging, and things like that. This is simply a video to show you how to review the cards yourself to try and work out the grades they're going to get in advance. Now, before I actually get into looking at any cards, I thought I'd first give a little rundown of the kind of setup that you want when you're going to be reviewing your cards to see if they're worth sending to PSA or Beckett. The kinds of cards most people send to be professionally graded are usually some of their more expensive and some of their better condition cards. And so throughout the whole process, you want to make sure that there's the minimum risk of damage to the cards possible. So the first thing, you've probably noticed that the background for this video is a little different to my other videos. And that's because I always use a nice playmat when I'm going to be reviewing cards to submit, to make sure that in the unlikely event that I do drop a card, it's going to land on a soft surface, and so it's not going to take any kind of damage. The next thing you'll need is a nice strong lamp. Unfortunately, the cable for my one doesn't stretch far enough to put it in the picture, but anything that's nice and strong, much brighter than regular ambient lighting in a room, should be good enough. Now, the other part of preparing to review your cards, which I think most people probably don't think about too much, is to do with your hands. So you're definitely going to want to wash your hands nice and thoroughly before looking at any cards to make sure that there isn't any dirt or grease on them that's going to transfer to the cards when you're holding it. You should always use your bare hands when handling cards like this rather than gloves, because when you wear gloves, your sensitivity is lower, and so you're more likely to either drop the card or apply too much pressure to the card, and it's harder to test for things like soft corners as well when you're wearing gloves. So yeah, don't wear gloves, but do wash your hands nice and thoroughly beforehand. And the other thing to do with your hands is to make sure that your nails are cut nice and short. It sounds a little silly, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. And as long as your nails are shorter than the end of your finger, then you know that when you're handling a card, there's very little risk that you're going to actually dig your fingernail into it. Whereas if you have longer fingernails, obviously you can be careful, but that's always still a risk you're going to have to take. And moving on to the process of how to actually handle a card and how to remove it from the sleeve and put it back in the sleeve, the best way to remove a card from a sleeve is always to apply pressure from the bottom until the card is far enough out that you can actually touch it with your hand. Then pinch the two sides and pull it out of the sleeve nice and gently. You don't want to be too quick with that motion, otherwise you can cause scratching up and down the card. And similarly, when you're putting it back in, you always want to be careful that you don't catch any of the corners on the sleeve. So go one corner first, and then slowly slide the other one in before you put it back down. And then in terms of when you hold a card, you typically just want to hold a card by the edges. You don't want to grab it by the surface like that. And you want to hold it so that it's over the palm of your hand, so that if you do accidentally drop it, it doesn't fall anywhere, it just falls back into your hand. And then when flipping the card over, similarly, you always want to touch the surface of the card as little as possible and pretty much just hold the edges. Okay, so now that's out the way, I'm going to go more into the actual process of reviewing your cards. Now, in this video, I've only got so much time, so I'm not going to go through how to review all kinds of cards in every condition. I'm only going to be focusing on the kinds of cards that will get somewhere between the 8 to 10 range if graded. So automatically that excludes any cards which have, for example, a stain, a water damage, a crease, a bend, even a small bend, and any kind of significant denting or anything like that. Any cards with those defects will always be 7s or worse, and I'm not going to cover them too much in this video. And I should also say that whilst this video is intended both for people looking to submit cards for PSA and to Beckett, the way I'm going to review cards in this video is using the same 4 subgrades that Beckett uses when you grade cards with them. So those are centering, surface, edges, and corners. And the reason I'm going to do it like that is because I feel, particularly for beginners in grading cards, it's very helpful to be able to break down the condition of cards into those 4 categories when you're assessing them to try and work out what kind of grade you can expect. You may remember that in my last video, I said when assessing the condition of cards, it's important just to focus on the condition and not be distracted by how good the card looks. But when it comes to assessing cards for professional grading, you actually have to focus both on the condition and on what's called the eye appeal of the card. In other words, how nice it looks. And the main thing that comes into that, which doesn't come into any other kind of condition grading, is the centering of a card. So what I mean by the centering is the way that the borders are aligned. So obviously every card has 4 borders, and on your ideal card, all 4 borders are the same size. Now you should be able to see that on this Injection Fairy Lily, the left border is a lot bigger than the right hand border, which is a very common problem with this card. And it'll be marked down by a professional grader because of that, because it's deemed that that kind of disproportionate ratio on the card detracts from the eye appeal. So if we look over the condition of this card, you should be able to see that both front and back, it looks extremely clean. I actually pulled this card myself from a Legacy of Darkness box a couple of years ago. But this card would not be able to get a perfect 10 grade either from PSA or from Beckett because of how bad the centering is. And in fact, it might not even be able to get a 9 because the left border is so much thicker than the right border. Now, learning to assess the centering of cards is something that it's hard to teach, and really it just comes with experience. But I'm just going to give a couple of demonstrations here of the different kind of centering patterns that equate to different grades. So first of all, here's a Wing Karibo, and if you look at the centering on this card, you can see that almost all the borders are exactly the same size, and that goes both for the front and for the back. So this is more or less a perfectly centered card, and this is the kind of card which could get a 10 on centering on the subgrade specifically from Beckett. But you don't need your card to be this well centered for it to be able to get a gem mint grade. And so if I pick up this Ultimate Insect level 1 Ultimate Rare here, you can see on this card the left border is quite a bit bigger than the right border, but it's nowhere near as bad as the Injection Fairy Lily. And this card is right around the kind of 60-40 ratio that PSA prescribes for whether a card is capable of getting a gem mint grade or not. Now obviously grading is subjective and standards vary from grader to grader, but in general this is the kind of ratio you're looking for, this or better, to be able to get a PSA 10 or a 9.5 on centering from Beckett. Okay, so now that centering's out the way, the next subgrade that I'm going to look at is edges. So a lot of people think when they first get into grading that a card must have to have perfect edges if it's going to get a PSA 10 or if it's going to get a gem mint grade, and that's not actually true. A card is allowed to have some extremely minor edge whitening, and as long as it doesn't detract from the overall appeal too much, it can still get that PSA 10 or BGS 9.5 grade. So on this Cyberdark Horn, I'm going to give a demonstration both of what can be acceptable for gem mint and what would not be considered acceptable. So if we look on the front of this card, on the right hand side, you can see that there's a very thin amount of whitening just here. Now what's important about this whitening is if we put it in the light, you can see it doesn't have any kind of 3D profile at all. And so what that means is it's not any kind of nick, it's literally just a bit of edge wear. And this kind of defect, if it's the only defect on your card, you can still expect it to get a PSA 10 overall, or at least a 9.5 on edges if you send it to Beckett. However, if we flip this card over to the back, you can see the left edge here doesn't have any whitening, or at least if it does, it's very minimal, just like the stuff on the front. But if we put it in the light, as we go down the edge, you should be able to see that there's a slight 3D profile to some of this edge wear. That kind of edge wear is what you call a nick, and it's when something has clipped the card and just ever so slightly lifted the edge. Now, an edge nick is more serious than just regular whitening. And with that kind of nick, you can immediately expect, if you sent this card to Beckett, that the edges are going to be knocked at least to a 9. And with PSA, if you got that kind of damage, you'd be pretty lucky to be able to get a 10 overall, even if the rest of your card is perfect. So that's the main thing to bear in mind with edges, is that whitening is acceptable, but actual nicks are more serious in terms of how they affect the overall grade. So at this point, we've covered centering and edges, and the next subgrade I'm going to look at is corners. So similar to edges, there are different kinds of corner defects, and they affect the grades pretty different amounts. So the first one, whitening, is pretty similar to edges. So if I zoom into the top left corner of this card, you should be able to see that there's a very minor amount of whitening right on the corner. And that kind of minimal whitening will not necessarily knock your card below a gem mint grade if it's only on one corner and there's nothing else accompanying it. So if that was the only thing wrong with the corners on this card, you could probably still expect it to get a 9.5 on corners from Beckett. However, if I flip this card over to the back and look at that same corner, you should be able to see that this corner is actually slightly dinged. What that means is, similar to an edge nick, a corner ding is when something has hit the corner, like if I flicked it, and it's lifted it up slightly. Now, a corner ding is much more serious than just whitening, and you could immediately expect that little ding to knock this card down, probably to an 8 on corners. If it's a really small ding, you might still just about be able to scrape a 9, but on the whole, you're probably going to get lower than that if you're dealing with a corner ding. Now, the final corner defect I'm going to mention, obviously I'm not mentioning bends or creases because I said earlier in the video, those knock the cards down below the 8 range immediately, and so they're not something I'm looking at here. But the final defect which I should mention is a soft corner. So if I try and reflect this corner in the light, I showed this in the last video as well, but you can see it doesn't quite reflect correctly. And the reason for that is that the layers of the card have separated slightly, resulting in a soft corner. Now, a soft corner is something that a lot of people miss, but it's very important to check for them when you're submitting a card for professional grading, because if your card has a soft corner, it does significantly impact the grade it gets. So, bearing in mind that soft corner, you'd probably expect this card to get something like a 7.5 on corners. Or if you were sending it to PSA, you'd probably expect a 7 overall, just as a result of having that soft corner. Now that we've gone over corners as well, that just leaves the surface to review, which is easily the most complicated of the 4 subgrades, because obviously most of a card is surface, so there's a lot to look at. So when you're looking at the surface, you've always got to be sure to look at it in a lot of different lights. So if we just take the front surface of this card, first you want to go left to right, moving down the card, to see if you pick up anything like that. And after you finish with that, you want to do the same thing up to down, because those 2 motions will pick up different kinds of scratches. This will pick up vertical scratches on the card, whilst the side-to-side motion will pick up the horizontal scratches that it has. So if we're looking at the front of this card, Yu-Gi-Oh! Foils don't tend to get too much scratching on them if they're in good shape, so there isn't anything to look at on the front. Now let's flip it over to the back and see if it's the same. So first we'll go top to bottom, and you can see right away there is some very, very minor scratching there. Now, minor scratching is almost inevitable on a card. It is possible to have a card which doesn't have any, but even the majority of cards which grade gem mint do have some kind of minor scratching like what you're seeing there. So if we continue that up and down motion, the card looks pretty good otherwise. You can't really see much. Now if we go left to right, the card still looks pretty good. There are very few horizontal scratches appearing. But if we get near the top of the card, you can see this slightly lighter strip appearing here. Now that's a factory defect. That's just a very small amount of wax on the surface of the card there. And this is the kind of surface defect where, especially if it's on the back, you can probably still expect a gem mint grade if nothing else is wrong with your card. So I would expect this card to get a 9.5 on surface from Beckett. It wouldn't be a 10 because of that light scratching and the little line, but also it shouldn't be a 9 because those are pretty minor defects. They're on the back, and there's nothing else wrong with the surface on either side. Now, probably some of the hardest surfaces to grade in Yu-Gi-Oh! are from the Soul of the Duelist Ultimate Rares. So if I look at this Ultimate Insect on the front, there's not much wrong with it, and that's pretty normal for these cards. But if we flip it over to the back, you'll see a few issues appearing when I put the card in the light. So the first thing is you can see there's a little bit of waxing running up and down the card. Now often it's a lot worse than this one, but you will nearly always have at least a small degree of waxing on these cards. And the other thing is if I try and capture it around where the ultimate square is on the front, you can see that the square is stamped through ever so slightly on the back, which again is a very common issue. Now, in my opinion, that kind of light stamping should not affect the grade, but in practice, a lot of graders, both at PSA and Beckett, are still not that familiar with Ultimate Rares, and so it's difficult to preview a grade when your card has that kind of defect. Sometimes the grader will realize it's a factory issue and will not dock it, but other times they will. And so that's just something you have to live with if you're going to be submitting cards to get professionally graded. In terms of the waxing, I chose this card because I would say this is the kind of level of waxing where, even though it is a defect, and your card certainly would not get a 10 on surface from Beckett, if this kind of minor waxing is the only thing on your card, it's not impossible for it to get the gem mint grade. So I would say this card deserves either a 9 or a 9.5 on surface, depending on the grader. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to mention to do with surfaces is denting or pressure marks. Now, on the whole, dents are something that's going to knock your card below the 8 range if they're significant in any way. But there are also such things as extremely minor dents. And so I thought I'd just run through what to expect if you're submitting a card with that kind of defect. So again, if we look at the surface on this card, we'll do the same thing we've done already. Just run it left to right and then up to down. You can see that there's really nothing wrong with the front. And if we look at the back, for the most part, it looks great. There's very little surface scratching or anything like that. You'd expect this card to at least be good enough to get a 9.5 on surface. However, if we zoom into this bottom left area, you should be able to see that there's a very, very small pin dent in the back there. Now, this is the kind of very small dent which does not actually impact the grade too heavily. Now, it does still impact the grade, obviously, because it is a dent and it is a defect. But if that kind of dent, one or two of those, is the only thing wrong with your card, then you can probably still expect it to get a 9 on surface. Or if you're sending it to PSA and that's the only defect, you can expect it to get a PSA 9 overall, or maybe even sneak a 10 depending on the grader. So yeah, those kind of minor pin dents, especially when they're factory defects, do not affect the grade too heavily, and your card can still be worth sending off to get a high grade, even if it has one or two of those. Okay, we've pretty much covered surface now, but just before I move on to a general sort of recap, I'm just going to go over what kind of levels of scratching are acceptable on cards, depending on if you're aiming for 9s or 8s or 9.5s or whatever the grade might be. So if you're aiming for a gem mint grade, the maximum level of scratching you're allowed is probably something like what you can see on this Skyscraper 2 here. So we're talking about some very, very light scratches on which you can only pick up when you look at the card in the light. The scratches cannot have any kind of 3D profile, so when you look at the card like this, you should not see any kind of 3D marking in the card. You only see them when you shine the light obliquely. So this is a kind of, again, borderline 9 to 9.5 surface if you're looking at it from a Beckett perspective. And that's pretty much as much scratching as you can get away with on a gem mint card normally. What I'll give an example of now is the kind of scratching you expect on an 8. So here's a Blasting Fuse Ultimate Rare. The front of this card is pretty good if we're looking at it. It doesn't have too much scratching, but as with most Yu-Gi-Oh cards, the scratching is focused on the back normally. So if I flip this over and put this one in the light, you can see that this has a lot more scratching than that Skyscraper I just showed you. And this kind of scratching, when it's more scuffing and it's all over the back, does affect the grade more significantly. And if you were sending this card off for professional grading, you'd probably expect it to get something like an 8 on surface, or as the overall grade, probably an 8 from PSA as well. Okay, so now we've been through all 4 of the subgrades, and we've pretty much gone through everything you'll need to look at when you're determining whether you want to send your cards off for grading or not. But just before I conclude this video, I thought I'd give a demonstration of what an overall gem mint card looks like. So this is the twin-headed Thunder Dragon we looked at earlier, and obviously we've already looked at the surface and decided it was good enough for a 9.5. But now we're going to look at the other 3 subgrades as well. So first of all, the centering of the card. You can see that top to bottom, the card is pretty much dead set. And if we're looking left to right, the centering is a little bit off to the left, but not too bad. And it's within that 60-40 ratio that you're looking for. So the centering is not something that's going to stop this card getting a gem mint grade. Next, we'll move to the edges. If we're looking at the edges on the front, all 4 edges look pretty sharp. And we'll flip it over to the back. And again, I can't see any kind of nick on the edges. And if we look at it face on, there's no kind of obvious whitening jumping out either. So the edges also are not going to stop this card getting a gem mint grade. Now we've said the surface is good enough for a gem mint as well. So the last thing to look at is corners. And again, I'm not seeing any kind of softness to any of the corners under the light. The corners are nicely shaped. There's no squareness to any of them. And on the back as well, there might be the tiniest bit of whitening on a couple of these corners, but nothing serious at all. And if I'm putting the corners in the light, there's no kind of ding there or any kind of lifting in the corner. So the corners, again, are not going to stop this card getting a gem mint grade. And that means that overall, if we send this card off to PSA or Beckett, we're probably going to expect an overall grade of a PSA 10 or a Beckett 9.5. And of course, just because that's the grade you preview, it doesn't mean that's the grade it's going to get. You know, if your grade is in a harsh mood, they might say the centering isn't quite good enough for a 10. Or anything else, they might be a little harsher on that line than we were. So there are always things that can vary, and you have to be aware of that when you're sending cards off. And you can never be too disappointed if your card doesn't get the grade that you think it's going to get. But nonetheless, it's very useful to go through this process because that will greatly reduce the margin for a discrepancy between what you think your card's going to grade and what it actually ends up grading. Alright, and that finally brings us to the end of this video. So I hope you guys found this video useful. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd appreciate it a lot if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel since it helps out a lot. And of course, if you have any questions about anything I said in this video, or if there's anything I didn't mention in this video which you're unsure of, just put them down in the comments below, and I'll always do my best to get back to everybody. And in the next video, I'm actually going to be going through the different options for grading companies. So I've mentioned PSA and Beckett both in this video, and I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison in terms of my thoughts on which company it's better to send cards to if there is a preferable option between the two. So yeah, thanks for watching everyone, and I will see you in the next video.